said to him.
I had to come to realize that this is who he is, and he's going to be happy. And so why am I judging him? I'm his father.
We're not doing he, we're not doing man, we're not doing gay. And, even like son, I was like, the world tried to give me that label, like Magic Johnson's son. And I was like, well.
And what happens? If you believe that isn't how you want to run your family, I have no choice but to respect that. But don't pretend as if it isn't an unpopular sentiment.
This was supposed to stay behind closed doors, but the moment Magic Johnson finally responded, everything exploded. Because what started as a simple comment from D.L. Hughley quickly turned into one of the most intense and uncomfortable celebrity clashes we've seen in a long time. And at the center of it all? A conversation nobody expected to go this far. It all began when D.L. said something that hit a nerve, not just online, but personally. What he framed as an opinion about parenting, public image, and celebrity families was taken very differently by Magic. Because this wasn't just commentary anymore. This involved his family, his son, his reality. And according to sources, that's when things got heated. Fast. Because Magic didn't just disagree. He confronted it. And the moment that confrontation became public, the internet split instantly. Some people said DL crossed a line he should have never touched. Others said he was simply saying what many were already thinking, just louder. But here's where it gets even more intense. Because this wasn't just about one comment. It was about everything behind it. Parenting choices. Public identity. Private struggles being discussed in public spaces. And then, one phrase started circulating that took this situation to another level. Mind your own daughter. That line? It changed everything. Because now, this wasn't just a disagreement. It was personal. And once things get personal in public like this, there's no going back. So the real question is, did D.L. Hughley just cross a boundary that should have never been crossed? Or did Magic Johnson's reaction expose something deeper that nobody was supposed to question? Because what happened next? No one was ready for it. To understand why this situation blew up the way it did, you have to go way beyond that one moment, that one comment, that one reaction. Because this wasn't random. This was tension that had been building for a long time, quietly, underneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to explode. And the moment it finally did, it pulled in names, opinions, and emotions that people were already divided on. On one side, you have Magic Johnson, not just a sports icon, but a global figure who has spent decades building an image of success, leadership, and influence. A man whose legacy goes far beyond basketball, into business, culture, and public respect. But behind that image, there's also the role he values most. Being a father. And that's where things start to get complicated. Because his relationship with his son, E.J. Johnson, has never been private. It's been public, visible, and constantly discussed. From red carpets to interviews, E.J. has always stood out, not just because of who his father is, but because of how he presents himself to the world. Bold. Confident. Unapologetic. A personality that doesn't just enter a room. It takes over. And for some people, that's inspiring. For others, it raises questions. And those questions have been floating around for years. Not always loud, not always direct. But always there. Now on the other side of this situation, you have D.L. Hughley. A comedian, yes, but also someone known for saying things that others avoid. He doesn't just entertain, he comments. He critiques. He pushes conversations into uncomfortable territory. And that's exactly what makes him both respected and controversial. Because when DL speaks, people listen. But they don't always agree. And this time, he didn't just speak about a general topic. He touched on something personal. Something sensitive. Something connected directly to Magic's family. And that's where everything started to shift. Because DL wasn't attacking from a place of hate, at least not in his framing. He made it clear that he supports people living how they want, expressing themselves freely, and being who they are. But then he added a but. And that but. That's what triggered everything. Because according to him, the issue wasn't identity. It was exposure. It was about what happens when private family dynamics are brought into the public spotlight, and then defended as something beyond question. He argued that when you present something to the world, when you put it on red carpets, interviews, and social media, you also open it up to public reaction. And that's where he drew the line. Now to some people, that sounded reasonable. To others, that sounded like criticism disguised as concern. And that's why this situation didn't stay neutral for long. Because once opinions started forming, they formed fast. Some defended DL, saying he was simply speaking truth, that celebrity families can't expect universal agreement when they make personal matters public. Others immediately pushed back, saying he crossed a boundary that should never be touched: someone's child, someone's identity, someone's life. And right in the middle of that storm was Magic Johnson. Now here's where the emotional weight really comes in. Because for Magic, this wasn't a debate. This wasn't commentary. This was his son. And when you bring a parent into a situation like that, logic takes a back seat. Emotion takes over. And according to sources, that's exactly what happened. Because Magic didn't just hear what DL said. He felt it. And when he responded, it wasn't calculated. It wasn't neutral. It was personal. But here's the deeper layer most people missed. This situation isn't just about disagreement. It's about perception. Because over the years, Magic has consistently shown public support for EJ. Interviews, appearances, statements, all pointing toward acceptance, love, and pride. But the internet? It doesn't always take things at face value. Some people believe what they see. Others question what's behind it. And that's where things get complicated. Because when DL made his comments, it didn't just spark a reaction. It reopened a conversation. A conversation about what support really looks like. Is it unconditional acceptance? Is it quiet understanding? Or is it something in between that people don't always talk about publicly? And once that conversation started, it spread. Because now people weren't just reacting to DL. They were analyzing Magic. His words. His expressions. His past interviews. Looking for clues. Looking for signs. Trying to figure out what's real and what's just public image. And that's what made this situation so explosive. Because it hit multiple layers at once. Family. Identity. Public vs private life. Support versus disagreement. And once all those layers collide, there's no simple resolution. Only more questions. And just when it seemed like this was going to stay as a debate, that's when things took a turn. Because this wasn't just about what DL said anymore. It became about how far the response would go. And what would be said next. Because when personal boundaries are crossed in public, the next move is always the most dangerous. And this is where everything stopped being a conversation and turned into a full-blown confrontation. Because up until this point, people were debating, arguing, choosing sides. But the moment Magic Johnson responded, that's when the energy shifted completely. According to sources and circulating reports, Magic didn't just brush off what DL. Hughley said. He took it personally. And not in a quiet way. Because this wasn't just a public figure responding to criticism. This was a father reacting to someone speaking on his child. And when that line gets crossed, things escalate fast. At first, the response seemed controlled. Subtle comments. Indirect reactions. The kind of statements that don't name names but make it clear who they are aimed at. But behind the scenes, it was heating up. Because insiders began hinting that Magic was not happy with how far DL had taken the conversation. Not just mentioning his son, but framing it in a way that people started questioning his parenting. And that's where the real conflict begins. Because criticizing a public figure is one thing. Questioning how they raised their child? That hits differently. And according to whispers coming from both camps, that's exactly what triggered the confrontation. Now here's where it gets intense. Because instead of keeping it strictly about the issue, the focus shifted from topic to personal. And that's when the phrase started circulating. Mind your own daughter. That line didn't just come out of nowhere. It was a response. A counter. A move that flipped the pressure right back onto DL. Because now, instead of just defending his own family, Magic was pointing at DL's. And that changed everything. Because the moment you bring someone else's child into the conversation, the tone becomes completely different. Now it's not debate anymore. It's confrontation. And the internet felt that shift immediately. Clips started spreading. Quotes were reposted. Reactions flooded in. And suddenly, people weren't just asking if DL was right or wrong. They were asking if Magic had gone too far. Because while some saw it as justified, a father defending his son at any cost, others saw it as a deflection. A way to avoid the original point by turning the spotlight onto someone else. And that's where the first major twist hits. Because instead of shutting the conversation down, that response made it bigger. Much bigger. Because now, people started comparing. DL's daughter versus EJ Johnson. Private life vs public life. Low profile vs high visibility. And those comparisons? They got uncomfortable. Fast. Some people pointed out that DL's daughter stays out of the spotlight, lives her life without making her identity the center of public attention. Others argued that EJ has every right to express himself however he wants, publicly, boldly, without apology. And just like that, the conversation split again. But this time, it was deeper. Because now it wasn't just about opinions. It was about lifestyles, values, choices, and how those choices are presented to the world. And here's where things get even more complicated. Because DL didn't back down. Not immediately. Instead, he doubled down on his stance, clarifying that his issue was never about identity itself, but about what happens when identity becomes a public narrative that people are expected to accept without question. Now, whether people agreed with that or not, it added fuel to the fire. Because now it looked like both sides were standing firm. Magic defending his family, DL defending his perspective, and neither willing to step back. But here's the twist nobody saw coming. Because while all of this was happening publicly, the internet started digging into something else entirely. Magic's past reactions. Old interviews. Moments where he spoke about his son. And people began analyzing them in a way they hadn't before. Looking for hesitation. Looking for discomfort. Looking for anything that might suggest there's more going on behind the scenes than what's shown publicly. And once that kind of analysis starts, it doesn't stop. Because people began saying things like, watch his body language. Listen to how he phrases things. Something feels off. Now, is that fair? That's up for debate. But perception becomes reality online. And that perception started spreading fast. Because now, the narrative wasn't just DL said something controversial. It became, did DL accidentally expose something real? And that question? That's what pushed this situation into a completely different level. Because now it wasn't just about what was said. It was about what might be true. And once that kind of speculation takes over, there's no controlling it. But the conflict didn't stop there. Because as the conversation intensified, so did the reactions. People started picking sides more aggressively. Defending. Attacking. Arguing. turning comment sections into battlegrounds. And through all of it, one thing became clear. This wasn't going to calm down anytime soon. Because now, both sides had something to prove. Magic had to stand firm in his defense. DL had to stand firm in his position. And the public? They were watching every move. Waiting for the next statement. The next reaction. The next escalation. Because once a situation reaches this level, there's always another twist coming. And just when it felt like the tension couldn't get any higher, something else surfaced. Something that shifted the conversation yet again. And made people question everything they thought they understood about this entire situation. And just when it felt like both sides had said enough, that the lines were drawn and the arguments were clear, that's when everything escalated to a level nobody expected. Because this didn't stay between Magic Johnson and DL Hughley anymore. The industry stepped in. And when that happened, the narrative completely shifted. It started subtly. A few influencers, a few media personalities, posting vague messages that didn't name anyone directly, but the timing made it obvious. Some people preach acceptance until it's uncomfortable. Protect your kids, but don't rewrite reality. Public life comes with public opinions, whether you like it or not. Those posts? They spread fast. Because people were already watching this situation closely, and now it felt like others with influence were quietly choosing sides. But then came the real escalation. A popular podcast clip went viral, one where a host broke down the situation in a way that made people stop and think. They didn't attack Magic. They didn't defend DL. Instead, they asked a question. A dangerous one. What if both sides are right, and that's why this feels so uncomfortable? That question? It hit hard. Because up until that moment, people were treating this like a clear right vs wrong situation. But now? It felt more complicated. And once complexity enters a viral story, everything slows down, just enough for people to really start thinking. But not everyone liked that. Because right after that clip went viral, something else started spreading. Alleged, behind-the-scenes, conversations. Unverified. Unconfirmed. But detailed enough to feel real. Some claimed that Magic had been frustrated for a long time, not with his son, but with how public everything had become. Others claimed DL had been warned not to bring this topic up publicly, and chose to do it anyway. Now again, none of this confirmed. But that didn't matter. Because the story was no longer just about facts. It was about perception. And perception was spiraling. Fast. Then came the shocking reveal that flipped everything again. Clips of E.J. Johnson started resurfacing, not just random ones, but specific moments where E.J. spoke openly, boldly, and confidently about himself. Statements that some people celebrated. And others? They questioned heavily. And suddenly, those clips weren't just entertainment anymore. They became evidence in the court of public opinion. People started saying, "Now I see what DL was talking about." Others pushed back instantly. That's confidence, not a problem. And just like that, the debate deepened. Because now, it wasn't just about what DL said. It was about whether what he said had context. And that's where things became even more intense. Because once people feel like a controversial opinion has proof behind it, they become louder, more confident, more aggressive. And that's exactly what happened. Meanwhile, Magic supporters weren't backing down either. They came in strong, defending him as a father who stood up for his child, no matter what the world says. They argued that no outsider, comedian or not, has the right to comment on someone else's family in that way. And that argument? It hit just as hard. Because it brought the focus back to something simple, but powerful. Family boundaries. And that's what made this situation so explosive. Because both sides had valid points. And when both sides feel justified, conflict doesn't end. It escalates. But here's where the tension reached another level. Because while all of this was happening, neither Magic nor DL fully stepped back. No clear resolution. No apology. No shutdown. Just continued reactions, continued discussions, continued pressure. And that's when the biggest question of all started spreading. Is this actually about EJ? Or is this about something deeper between Magic and DL? Because when two public figures clash like this, there's usually history, respect, ego, unspoken tension. And some people began suggesting this wasn't the first time they disagreed. Just the first time it became public. Now, whether that's true or not, it adds another layer. Because it changes how people view every interaction, every word, every reaction. And suddenly, what looked like a single controversy starts to feel like part of a bigger story. But here's the part that really shook people. Despite everything, despite the backlash, the debates, the viral clips, Magic Johnson didn't back down from defending his son. And DL Hughley didn't back down from his stance. Two strong positions. No compromise. And a public court right in the middle. And that's what makes this moment so unpredictable. Because when neither side moves, something eventually forces a shift. And that shift could come from anywhere. A new statement. A new clip. A new revelation. Because at this point, all it takes is one more detail to completely flip the narrative again. And if that happens, everything we've seen so far might just be the setup for something even bigger. Because this situation is far from over. The moment this situation hit the internet, it didn't just trend, it divided people instantly. Because this wasn't just another celebrity disagreement. This was Magic Johnson versus DL Hughley, and at the center of it all, EJ Johnson. And the reactions? They came in waves. Fast. Loud. And completely split. On one side, you had people defending Magic, not as a celebrity, but as a father. They didn't care about the debate. They didn't care about the opinions. Their stance was simple. You don't talk about someone's child. Period. For them, it didn't matter what DL said or how he framed it. The moment he brought Magic's son into the conversation, that was the line. Crossed. And once that line is crossed, anything that comes after feels justified. That's why when the phrase, "mind your own daughter," started circulating, that group didn't see it as harsh. They saw it as necessary. A response to a response. But then, there was the other side. And they weren't backing down either. They argued that DL wasn't attacking, he was commenting. That when something is public, it becomes open to discussion. And not just praise. Criticism too. They said this wasn't about disrespect. It was about honesty. And that's what made this situation so intense. Because both sides believed they were right. And when that happens, the internet doesn't calm down. It escalates. Then came the deeper debates. Not just about Magic and DL, but about something bigger. Parenting. Public identity. Boundaries. People started asking questions like, should celebrity families be off limits completely? Where is the line between support and enabling? Can public figures control how their personal lives are discussed? And those questions? They didn't have simple answers. Which made the debate even more heated. Because now, people weren't just reacting emotionally. They were thinking. And when people think and feel strongly at the same time, that's when discussions turned into arguments. Then came the influencers. Some sided with Magic, posting messages about protecting family, respecting boundaries, and not turning personal lives into public debates. Others leaned toward DL's perspective, talking about freedom of speech, public accountability, and the reality that once something is in the spotlight, it's open to interpretation. And just like that, the divide got wider. But here's where things got even more intense. Because the comment sections, they turned into battlegrounds. Not just simple opinions. Full debates. People going back and forth, defending their stance, challenging others, bringing in past examples, even comparing this situation to other celebrity families. And once comparisons start, the conversation gets even bigger. Names like other public figures and their families started getting pulled into the discussion. Different situations. Different outcomes. All used to support one argument or the other. And that's how a single controversy turns into a full cultural conversation. But not all reactions were loud. Some were quiet, subtle, observational. There were people who didn't pick a side at all. Instead, they focused on something else. The discomfort. Because regardless of where you stand, there's something about this situation that feels uneasy. Not because it's shocking, but because it's real. It touches on things people deal with privately, now being debated publicly. And that's what makes it powerful. Because people aren't just watching this. They are seeing reflections of their own beliefs, their own experiences, their own values. And that's why the reactions are so strong. But here's the key detail that kept the conversation alive. No resolution. No apology. No clear ending. Just ongoing reactions. And in today's world, that's what keeps something trending. Because people don't just react once. They come back. They check for updates. They wait for the next move. And with both Magic and DL holding their ground, that next move feels inevitable. Because situations like this don't just fade away. They build. They evolve. They escalate. And right now, the entire internet is watching. Waiting. Because everyone knows something else is coming. And whatever that next moment is, it might be the one that changes everything again. And just when it seemed like every opinion had been shared, every side had been chosen, and the situation had reached its peak, that's when the final twist started to surface, and it didn't come from a new argument. It came from something much quieter. Reflection. Because as the noise settled, even just a little, people began looking at this situation differently. Not just as a clash between Magic Johnson and DL Hughley, but as something deeper. Something more uncomfortable. Because for the first time, the conversation shifted away from who said what, and towards something nobody was ready to fully confront. Why did this hit so hard in the first place? Think about it. Out of all the celebrity disagreements that happen every week, why did this one explode the way it did? Why did people feel so strongly? Why did it divide audiences so quickly? And that's where the real twist begins. Because some people started realizing this wasn't just about EJ. It wasn't even just about the comments. It was about what those comments represented. For some, this situation represented a father standing firm, protecting his child from what he saw as unnecessary criticism. For others, it represented something completely different. A moment where someone said what many people think, but rarely say publicly. And that clash? That's what made this situation impossible to ignore. But here's where things get even more intense. Because as people began revisiting old interviews, past appearances, subtle reactions from EJ Johnson and Magic, a new question started forming. A dangerous one. What if both sides are reacting to something that's never been fully addressed publicly? Not confirmed. Not proven. But felt. Because when you look at everything together, the comments, the responses, the reactions, it doesn't feel like a random moment. It feels like something that had been building. And when something builds quietly over time, it eventually finds a way out. And maybe this was that moment. But here's the part that really changed how people saw everything. Despite all the noise, despite all the pressure, neither side backed down. No apology from Magic. No full retreat from DL. Just two strong positions. Standing firm. And that kind of standoff? It doesn't end quickly. It builds tension. Because now, the next move matters more than anything that's already happened. And that's what people are waiting for. Because one statement, one interview, one unexpected reaction could flip the entire narrative again. And here's what makes it even more unpredictable. This isn't just a private situation anymore. It's public. Massively public. Which means every move from here on out will be watched, analyzed, interpreted, and possibly misinterpreted. And that's where things get risky. Because once a situation reaches this level, it's no longer just controlled by the people involved. It's controlled by perception. And perception changes fast. But the biggest twist of all might be this. What if this situation never gets resolved? What if there's no final statement, no closure, no clear answer? Because sometimes, the lack of resolution is what keeps something alive. And right now, this situation is still very much alive. Because people are still asking questions. Still debating. Still choosing sides. And as long as that continues, this story doesn't end. It evolves. And if it evolves, that means more reactions are coming. More discussions. More pressure. Because eventually, something has to give. And when it does, that moment might be the one that defines everything that came before it. So now we're left with one final question. What happens when two powerful voices refuse to back down? And the entire world is watching? Because whatever comes next, it won't just be another reaction. It could be the moment that changes how this entire situation is remembered. Now, after everything you've just seen, every statement, every reaction, every twist, this situation between Magic Johnson and DL Hughley isn't just a headline anymore. It's a full-blown debate. And now I need to hear from you. Be real for a second. Do you think DL Hughley crossed a line by speaking on someone else's family? Or do you think he was simply saying what many people are afraid to say out loud? And what about Magic Johnson? Do you see his reaction as a father protecting his son no matter what? Or do you think that response made things more personal than they needed to be? And here's the deeper question. When something becomes public, whether it's a lifestyle, a personality, or a family dynamic, should it automatically be open for discussion? Or are there still boundaries that shouldn't be crossed, no matter what? Because this isn't just about celebrities. This touches on real conversations happening everywhere, in families, in communities, and online. So where do you stand? Drop your honest opinion in the comments right now, no holding back. I want to see real discussions under this video. And trust me, I'll be reading them. Also, if you made it this far, you already know this story isn't over. Because situations like this don't just disappear. They evolve. And if either side decides to respond again, whether it's a new interview, a statement, or something unexpected, this entire narrative could flip overnight. So make sure you like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because the next update on this situation, it might be even bigger than what we just saw. Stay locked in, because this one is far from finished.